All right, guys. So this is lesson 1, part 2. We left off here last time, characteristics of social science, and this is where we're picking things up. I wanted to remind you of something, or just not remind you of something, but alert you to something, and that is that during the course of our lectures and also with the reading material in the book, there's going to be a fair amount of repetition. That's just the nature of this course. We visit concepts and then we revisit concepts. So don't be confused by that. Sometimes students are confused. They're like, haven't we already studied this? That's just the nature of the class. We visit stuff and we revisit stuff. So don't let that confuse you. So theories. This is where we're going to pick up today's part 2 of lesson 1. Theories are really important to the research process. We are interested in developing theories, building theories, and when we're not building theories or developing theories, we're using theories in our research. We base our research projects on theories. And what is a theory? It's a statement of relationships among concepts that predicts phenomena and suggests explanation. So let me give you an example. In our field, and some of you have taken 205 and you've taken com theory, so you've got you've got some theories in your repertoire. But a really good example is the third person effect theory. It's a theory in our field that suggests that people believe that negative media messages will not affect them, but they will affect other people. They'll affect the third person. That's why it's called the third person effect. So people believe, and there's a ton of evidence for this, they've done many studies, people believe that negative media messages like violent messages or pornography, stuff like that, will not affect them, but they will affect other people. So it's kind of an interesting theory. There's a lot of evidence for it. What happens is scholars make these observations. They do these studies, study after study. They make these observations, and then the observations become sort of consistent, and they can say, look, we know what's happening here. And then they just give it a name, and that's what they did. We're going to call this the third person effect, right? And now we can use that theory to predict if there's some new negative thing, some really negative video game that comes out tomorrow. We can predict using the third person effect that a lot of people are going to say, doesn't affect me, won't affect me, but it'll affect other people. And therefore we should think about restricting these messages. So theories are really important to the research process. You're not going to come up with any theories in this class. You're not going to become a theoretician, but you are going to use theory quite a bit. And in particular, in your research, in your final research projects, they have to be based on, your projects have to be based on a theory. There has to be a theoretical framework section in your project, and we'll talk more about that. And as we progress, I would really like to be able to talk with your groups about your projects. I'll work closely with you on those projects. I mean, it's still early right now as you're listening to this, but you want to try to start relatively early, that you're going to be working in groups, and I'll kind of help you out. I'll kind of guide you a little bit. You can run your topic ideas by me, run your theoretical framework suggestions by me, and I'll give you some feedback. We might be able to do some chatting on Skype or whatever. One of the good things about theories is that they yield hypotheses. Hypotheses are basically educated scientific guesses. So we can hypothesize based on agenda setting theory. Agenda setting theory says that the media set our agenda. They set the public's agenda. So if the media are talking about something, that something is on our minds. We think it's important. Okay? It gets us to think about that stuff. The media gets us to think about stuff, is basically what agenda setting theory says. Okay? So we can hypothesize based on agenda setting that if the media cover President Obama's next foreign trip, if they cover it prominently, a lot of Americans are going to be thinking about President Obama's foreign policy and whatever his meeting was, because that's what agenda setting suggests. So hypotheses allow us to, I should say, theories allow us to develop these hypotheses. Okay, there are theories about media violence, right? There's a theory in our field called social learning theory, which suggests that people learn from and model behavior that they see other people carrying out, including behavior in the media. So people can model and in some cases even imitate behavior that they see. So we can predict that if there's if there's a lot of media violence and people are watching this media violence, that people are going to model this behavior. We can hypothesize that people will model the violent behavior. We make that prediction, that hypothesis, based on the theory. So the theory gives you a hypothesis or a set of hypotheses. So theories try to explain why we behave or think the way we do. They operate on generalities like science does. We talked about that in part 1. We can't test every single person or situation. And so therefore, we don't say theories prove things. We say they explain, they suggest, they predict, but don't use the word prove. We like to be much more cautious with the way we describe things. Theories have to be falsifiable. I won't spend a lot of time on that, but I will say that when you set up a hypothesis, you set up a study, you have to give yourself a chance to be wrong. It's not a valid study if there's no way that your hypothesis could ever be shown to be not supported, right? We constantly test theories. We have so many theories in our field. There are dozens of mass communication theories. And people just keep doing study after study after study on the same theories just to kind of see if they continue to hold true in different situations and in different contexts, in different times, right? With different people, different populations, different sample groups, and so on and so forth. So you all engage in research. When you get onto Google and search for the nearest Mexican restaurant and you look at reviews or whatever, or look at the menu and the prices and stuff like that, that's research, but it's not scientific research. Scientific research is a set of procedures for the systematic and objective observation, collection, processing, analysis, and reporting of information. So we follow a set of steps when we do scientific research, as we said earlier, right? We're objective. We're observing things objectively and systematically, right? And then we report whatever we find, whether we agree with it, whether we like it or not. We report what we find. That's how we engage in scientific research. This is a quote from McCombs and Poindexter. They say, "The scientific method differs from other methods of knowing because it uses specific procedures, independent of tenacious beliefs, authoritative sources, and intuition, for objectively observing phenomena to discover evidence that supports or refutes propositions, that supports or refutes hypotheses," right? So we have very specific procedures. You can't just carry out scientific research, haphazardly. It's systematic. We follow specific procedures, and following these procedures allows us to be very systematic and to discover evidence, to come up with evidence that is much more convincing, much more credible than the kinds of informal research that we do in our day-to-day lives, right? And research is very useful for testing claims. There are all kinds of claims around us. Muslims are terrorists. Americans are ignorant. The President Obama's economic policies are a failure. or are a success. I mean, people claim things. If you just turn on the TV, you'll hear 100 claims. I mean, if you listen to your friends or whatever, scientists are interested. They don't just take these claims at face value. They actually want to put them to the test. And again, what is your evidence at the end of the day? What's your evidence? What's the empirical evidence for your claim? If there's evidence, science will accept it. Scientists will accept it. If not, then they'll refute it. So, scientific research is very structured. It's valid and it's high in credibility. So, if I tell you that if I tell you that I took a random sample of CNN and Fox News episodes or news bulletins over the last year, and I asked a series of questions systematically about every single report that I saw, and I asked the same questions of both networks, and then I told you what I found, you'd probably be more likely to believe me than if your Uncle Bill just says, I watch CNN and Fox News and I think, one of them is great and one of them is trash, right? I mean, it's one of those things where the scientific research process, it really kind of protects us in a way. And it's a much more convincing, much more credible a much more convincing and much more credible process. And that's why people tend to trust scientific findings, whereas they'll be much more skeptical of casual observations that people make based on informal research, informal analysis, right? If I tell you that, it seems, wow, the movies are really violent today. They're much more violent today than they were when I was growing up. You're probably going to have some skepticism. You say, well, I don't know. I mean, how do you know that? Well, I watch movies, and I watch a lot of them, and I watched movies when I was a kid, so I know that movies are much more credible, are much more violent now. But you should have some doubt about someone who says that, because there was no systematic study. Now, if I tell you that I took a random sample of movies from the 1980s and movies from the 2000s, and I compared them on the basis of a number of measures related to violence, and I show you the numbers, now you'll be much more likely to accept what I say, right? So scientific research is more credible than informal, casual research, unscientific research. One of the reasons why we accept scientific findings for the most part is because science is based on peer review. This is an important concept, so pay attention. When I say find an article in a scholarly journal, and I will say that to you during the course of this semester for your assignments, what I really mean is find a peer-reviewed article. And what does that mean? When we publish scientific research, we send our research papers to journals, scientific journals, academic journals, scholarly journals, peer-reviewed journals, right? What happens is, so I send my paper to this journal. They don't just publish it. They review it. But they don't just review it. They don't just give it any review. They give it a scholarly, scientific peer review. So what that means is they take your name off the paper so that nobody knows, so that the reviewers don't know who wrote it. Because sometimes what happens is if you know who wrote the paper, you might be more inclined to accept it. Like, wow, this guy's a really good scholar. It must be good. I'll accept it. Or you say, wow, this person, they're not very good. I don't know who this person is. Or I don't like this person, so I'll reject it. So they take the name off. Then they send the paper off to 2 or 3 different experts in this area, in this research area. They send it to 2 or 3 different experts. And these experts review the paper independently of one another. It's a completely blind and independent process. Okay? And they each evaluate the paper. If they all like it and say this is it's a sound paper, it's methodologically sound, the results are interesting and important, and this is a contributory paper, they'll publish it. If not, they won't. And the standards are very high. They're very rigorous. They're very rigorous. Just to give you an idea, some of the journals in our field have acceptance rates in the 8% range. That means 92% of the papers that are submitted for review get rejected. And remember, the people who are submitting the papers are usually mostly professors. So they're established, very good researchers, and their papers get rejected. I've had my papers rejected more times than I'd care to admit, right? And you have to, when you get rejected, you have to go back and revise the paper. And sometimes the revisions take months to complete. And then you resubmit it, and you might get rejected again. But ultimately, you have to keep pushing through until, and the idea is that the only things that get published are the really good, the really good papers. Okay, that's kind of the idea. The scientific method, one of the reasons why it's important is because it's public. We talked about that. It's one of the characteristics of science is that it's public. Well, I'm going to give you an example of why that is so important, that the scientific method and scientific research is public. So there was this researcher named Samuel Morton who was living in the middle of the early mid 19th century, at a time when America was, there was still slavery at that time. It was a very racist society, and he was a craniometrist. He studied craniums, and he was interested in studying the intelligence of different races. And what he would do is he would collect craniums. He would collect the craniums of black people and white people. And he hypothesized that the white people would have larger craniums and that they were more intelligent. And because he said that if you could, the larger the cranium, the larger the brain. Now, even that is problematic, but let's just leave that alone for a moment. Let's just examine what he actually did. So he gathers all these craniums, and he basically seals them up, and then he fills them up with liquid, and then he measures the weight of the craniums, right? And he ends up finding that the white craniums are heavier. And he says, and he writes a paper, white people, this is proof, right, in his words, this is proof that white people are more intelligent than black people, because I measured these craniums, and the white people's craniums were larger. But remember, the scientific method is public. So somebody else came along and said, I'd like to take a look at his data and his instruments here and see what happened. Goes back after Samuel Morton had died, gets these craniums, fills them up, does the same study. He replicates the study. Remember that from lesson 1, from part 1? Replication. Replicates a study. What does he find? He finds something very interesting. He finds that the black craniums, the craniums from black people, were mostly from children that had died young. And the white people, they were from fully grown white adults who had died in adulthood. Okay? So this is a scientifically invalid study because he wasn't doing an apples to apples comparison. He was comparing the craniums of children to the craniums of adults, right? And he also found that he didn't fill the black craniums up all the way. So he underestimated their measures and their weight, and he filled the white craniums up all the way to the top. So he was finding what he wanted to find. Maybe that was conscious, maybe it was unconscious, but he may have just been influenced subconsciously by his racist outlook. We don't know. But in any case, the fact that this was public, right, meant that people could go back and replicate the study and repeat, and other people did other studies after this, right, with other data, right, to kind of refute what Samuel Morton had argued in his work. So let's think about the steps in the research process. You might think, well, boy, I have to do a research project for this class. How am I going to do it? You do have a research project, by the way, for this class, as you know. It's going to be done in groups of probably 3 or 4. We'll talk about that later. But you're going to have to go through these steps. Most of them. You're not going to have to go through all of them because you're not actually going to collect data. You're just going to set up a study, but you're not actually going to collect data. So that makes it a lot easier and much more manageable. But the very first thing that you have to do is come up with a topic. So think about a problem. Think about your own experience with communication. Read other studies. Read other studies. Look at the database, the academic database. And actually, I'm going to show that to you right now. I'm going to go to the UNA website. So follow along. I'm just going to show you how to access the database. It's called Communication and Mass Media Complete. I go up here, click on Library. So now I'm at una.edu/library. I'm going to scroll down to the databases, and I'm going to do databases by title. Then I'm going to click on the letter C. I'm going to scroll down to Communication and Mass Media Complete, and here it comes, slowly but surely. There it is. Voila. If it's not in advanced search, make sure it is. Sometimes when you open it up, it'll be in basic search. You don't want this. You want to click on advanced search. Make sure this is the look that you get. And then you come down here and you click on this, scholarly, and then in parentheses, peer-reviewed journals. That makes sure, because sometimes this database will come up with stuff that's not scholarly. Most of it is, but there'll be some things that aren't. So you always want to make sure you check that box. And then you can just do a search for whatever you want to find. Let's say you're interested in, let's say you are interested in race and the news. Race. I'm going to search for those two terms and let's see what we find. Here we go. We got 577 things. I get to go through these and see what works. The changing misrepresentation of race and crime on network and cable news. That seems pretty interesting. A new study published in February of 2015 about race and how different races are covered on network and cable news in the context of crime. Okay? And what you can do is if you click on this, it'll take you into the abstract. So it gives you the authors and the keywords, but here's the abstract. The abstract is just a little summary of the study, and that's really useful. You can read a bunch of abstracts and get a whole bunch of ideas for studies of your own. And that's the great thing about this database. You can just go through and scroll through, read titles and abstracts. You don't have to read the whole study, and it'll give you ideas for stuff that you can do. Okay, and then you can also click on, where is it? Here we go, linked full text. If I clicked on that, the entire paper would open up and I could read the entire paper. So go into this database and just play with it. This is an assignment, okay? You're not going to be graded on this, but everyone should do this, trust me. And then if you have questions, let me know. Come into this database, click on the scholarly peer-reviewed box here, and then just start playing around with it, finding different studies, read a bunch of abstracts. It'll take, spend 15 or 20 minutes on that. Let me know if you have any questions. But you're going to need that for your article review assignment, because for your article review assignment, remember what you're going to do there is you're going to find a scholarly peer-reviewed article. Okay, you're going to find a peer-reviewed article, and you're gonna read it and then review it basically, and then provide like an analysis of that article. So that's kind of the first thing you have to do is go into that database and find an article. It can be any article, as long as it's scholarly. And what I am going to make a requirement that for article review number 1, the article that you choose has to be a content analysis. So let me just back up. In our field, there are basically 3 methods that we use. 3 quantitative methods. There's a difference between quantitative methods and qualitative methods. Okay? Quantitative research methods are methods that use and produce numbers. Qualitative research is more interpretive. It just describes things. So there are three primary quantitative methods. They are content analysis, experiments, and surveys. I'm going to say those again. Pay attention. Content analysis, experiments, and surveys. When you want to study content, like let's say you want to study Fox News, the content, what does it say? What does Fox News say on their news programs? You're going to do a content analysis. When you want to study cause and effect, you're going to do an experiment. I'm going to talk about all of this later, but I need to explain this now so that I can talk about the article review assignment a little bit. So if you want to study cause and effect, you do an experiment. So let's say you want to find out about what are the effects of watching Fox News on people's political opinions. That would be an experiment. So if you want to find out what does Fox News cover and how do they cover it, that's a content analysis. If you want to study the effects of Fox News or what effects of whatever, then you do an experiment. And I'll talk about and define these more later. If you want to find out what people's attitudes are about Fox News or their beliefs or their perceptions, then you would do a survey. Those are the three methods that we use, the three primary quantitative methods that we use in our field. The first article review assignment, I want you to review a content analysis. So what you're going to do is you're going to go into the database that I just showed you, and you might just do a search, content analysis, and just see what comes up. You could do whatever you want. I mean, you might do content analysis and gender, content analysis and race, content analysis and movies. Let's say you want to find studies about that have looked at the content of movies. Whatever you're interested. I mean, just something that you're interested in. I don't care what it is, as long as it's a scholarly article and it's a content analysis. You can do it. Before you start working on your article review, please email me the article. And I mean, when I say email, I mean email me an attachment to say, this is the article that I'm going to do my review on. That way I can, if there's a problem, I'll catch it. Because I don't want you to complete a review on a paper that isn't appropriate. Okay? So for the second article review, you're going to do either a survey or an experiment. You're going to review a survey or an experiment. Okay? So we'll talk more about that stuff later. Let me know if you have questions about your article review assignment. So that database is going to come in real handy. It's also going to come in handy on that final project, because for your final project, you're going to have to do a literature review. And speaking of literature reviews, nice segue, because the second thing you do, once you have a topic in mind, the second step in research is to review existing research. You have to do a literature review. That means you're saying, I'm not the first person to have ever done a study like this. So what I want to do is go back and read all of the other studies that have been done, or most of them, or many of them, and read them and review them in a section that we call it literature review. And just kind of summarize and synthesize the main findings from that area, that body of research. Okay, so that's what a literature review does. It basically reviews what other scholars have done in a particular research area. Okay, so that's the second step. And then also, and theory. So you have to identify a theoretical framework, some kind of a theory that will help inform your project. Based on your theory, like we talked about, you're going to develop some hypotheses or research questions, or both hypotheses and research questions. Maybe one or the other, or maybe both. What is a hypothesis? Again, it's an educated guess. It's a concise statement that helps guide your research, right? It shouldn't be too broad. It shouldn't be too narrow. Here's an example of a research question. What's the impact of the internet on newspaper reading? We could rephrase that if we're confident in what we're going to find, or we have some reason to believe that we know what the answer is going to be, or what it might be. We might present a hypothesis, a guess, an educated guess. As internet use increases, newspaper reading decreases. That's an example of a hypothesis. Once you've developed your hypotheses or your research questions, you've got to decide on a methodology. Remember, we talked about in quantitative research, content analysis, experiments, and surveys. There are also qualitative methods. We'll talk about those later. You might decide to triangulate. See that word there, triangulation? Triangulation is just, you might use, triangulation is when you use one quantitative method and one qualitative method. At least one quantitative method and at least one qualitative method in the same study to basically test the hypotheses, right? In one study. So so sometimes you do both. You'll do more, multi-method research. That's really hardcore. It's hard to do because it takes a lot of time. It's hard enough to do one method, but sometimes you have to do two methods. And some people there have been studies where they've done three methods. And that takes a lot of time. So once you've decided on your methodology, then you're going to collect data, analyze the data, and then present the results in your paper. You're going to write the paper. Those are the basic steps. And like I said, you're going to have a chance to do this on your final project. Everything except you're not going to collect and analyze the data and write up the results. I mean, you're just going to set up the study. So you'll do your introduction, a literature review, a theoretical framework, and a methodology section. There'll be 4 sections on your final project. Your final project is going to be done in groups. I'll send you the groups, the members of your groups later. But you're going to basically do an introduction, a literature review, a theoretical framework, and then a methodology section. So 4 sections. Every paper that I get is going to have 4 sections in it. And it'll be about 10 pages, give or take. I'm going to stop here, and we'll take this up in part 3. Hopefully this worked.